I want to apologise in advance for saturating the market with yet another podcast.
Natasha, it's a bit too late. We've already done it.
No, we need more rehearsal time.
Launch and iterate is our mantra in the tech world. I told you, only actors get to rehearse.
Our podcast is called Where Shall We Meet? And you can probably hear why.
In upcoming episodes, you'll hear from a doctor about psychedelic therapy,
A polar explorer,
a DeepMind researcher,
a journalist, author, and media commentator,
a futurist,
a composer and musician extraordinaire,
an entrepreneur building the first Gen AI dating app.
sounds frightening, and a lot more.
We're still newbies and started off with some suboptimal recording equipment, so we have to apologize for the sound quality and creaking chairs in some of the initial episodes. We have now cleaned up our act, so don't worry.
Our guest today is Alastair Campbell, who doesn't really need an introduction if you already listened to his podcast, The Rest is Politics. Alistair served under Tony Blair as Downing Street press secretary from 1997 till 2000, and then became Downing Street's director of communications and strategy from 2000 till 2003, playing a pivotal role in shaping the new Labour. He's an accomplished author, publishing both best-selling novels and non-fiction books about mental health, the media, the environment, and most recently 2 books for kids, Why Politics Matters and Alastair Campbell Talks Politics, which I can't wait to buy for all the youngsters in my life. Today, we'll be speaking to him about democracy.
Quick housekeeping. When we recorded this episode, the date for our general election hadn't been announced yet.
That's true, yeah.
Neither had the election results in India come through. Don't worry, we're just catching up now. We'll be up to date from here on out.
Hello, my name's Natasha McElhone.
Hi, I'm Omid Ashtari, and we are here with...
Do I have to say my name?
You have to.
My name is Alastair Campbell.
Thanks for taking the time, Alistair.
Pleasure.
We talk about innovating democracy today.
I know you do.
So I thought as a starting off point, I wanted to set the scene and say that from an outsider's perspective, if you'd looked at the early 21st century, you'd think that Western democracies are a little bit on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
And that, say, the Chinese model until recently seemed like it was on the up and up, that you have city-states like Singapore that seem to have it very much together, that you have autocracies like, the UAE that build skyscrapers up into the sky and are a little bit more competent in building infrastructure. And while I don't want to dwell too much on the premise of that, I wanted to maybe go on a little bit of a tour of exploring different models as a launch pad, and then get back maybe to the premise after we've had this tour.
I think Singapore would reject being included in the same paragraph as China, as
yes, absolutely.
democratic systems go.
Yes.
I think democracy is in a bit of a state for all sorts of reasons. And it's not, I don't think it's that people suddenly say to themselves, we don't want democracy, we don't need democracy, although some people are saying that in the democracies. I think it's more that the demands and expectations upon the democracies have weighed them down. And I think part of that is the political electoral model that a lot of the democracies use, which is to say, vote for me and I will make sure you got a job. I will make sure your health services are good. I will make sure your kids get a good education. I will pretty much make your life easy and comfortable and fine and everything's going to be dandy. And what's happened in the current generation is that 2 things have collided. The first is that it's as kids growing up today, the first generation in a lot of the democracies who are unable to say they're going to be better off than their parents.
Right.
That's a massive thing. Alongside a generation of politicians represented by people like Trump and people like Johnson, people like Modi and people like Erdogan, who are populist in nature. And therefore, instead of challenging that model, vote for me and I'll give you everything, vote for the other guy and your life's going to be an utter misery, they absolutely play into that.
Right.
So I think that, and the other thing that's happened, there's no point, you mentioned the UAE there, and likewise China. I can remember the very, very first time I saw a piece of paper in Downing Street about the arguments for and against the third runway at Heathrow Airport.
Right.
It was 1998. So here we are now, 26 years later, still having that argument.
Yes.
And how many airports have the Chinese built in that time?
Yeah, exactly.
how much of an infrastructure has been built in some of the Gulf states where they've got both the money and the systems that allow them to do pretty much what they want. So I think that is all combining to lead people to question whether we should be so cocky and so arrogant about the fact that we have these supposedly great systems of democracy. And then throw in the fact that, I wrote a book last year called But What Can I Do?, which is about trying to get more people engaged in democracy and politics and citizenship and so forth. And one of the points I made is that, just take where we're sitting here in London, just take Britain. The stuff that has happened in our politics in recent years that would have been unthinkable even 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Unthinkable. Somebody like Johnson becoming Prime Minister, Brexit happening, and then no accountability for the lies on which it was fought and won, no accountability for the fact that the Brexit that's been delivered has nothing to do with the Brexit that was promised, and now no debate about it. The corruption that we saw during COVID, the normalisation of lying in politics. These are things that I don't think growing up I ever thought would come to Britain, and they have.
Yeah.
So I think that democracies have now got these massive strains within them, and I don't think that as democracies that we're really facing up to the consequences.
Can I just push back on two things? Firstly, kids today or a new generation will for the first time not be better off than their parents. What metric? Are you just talking economically? Or I would say that people today have so much opportunity to innovate, to create, to make things. It's a much, much more exciting landscape in terms of work and changing your job through life.
I get that.
Access to education, whether it's online.
I think, look, the metric is economic, but I think within that, we've got in here in the UK, we've got levels of poverty now that I just thought were never going to come back. And it's almost like they're not even involved or part of the debate.
You're referring to the Child Poverty Report recently.
Yeah. And also you've got, and within education, I don't agree that that kids today are confronted with massive opportunities. Some are, but I think it's become a very, very unequal
But
society.
I guess I just mean the internet gives access in a way that we never, ever, ever had it before.
Sure. And there's been good to that and there's been bad to that. But my point is that throughout our lifetime, there's just been this expectation that you're going to do better than your parents did. My point is that I don't think that can be taken for granted by a majority. And that puts massive pressure on a democratic structure. Because democracy has to be about progress.
Yeah, I mean, the point is when the hope for the future is no longer there, everything becomes more transactional.
Well, the hope for the same future, I guess what I'm asking is, are we in an unhappy valley of something, and we're on a tipping point of something where we really are going to change, and we're going to change structurally, and perhaps it's really exciting, and we're going to create a very, very different kind of world. So hearkening back to, oh no, we can no longer afford to buy a house, and we can no longer afford... I don't know how useful that is, because I feel society has changed so much.
Yes.
Not just to do with the technological revolution, but the way that we communicate, the way that we meet, everything.
I'd like to take us back maybe, so acknowledging all the things that you're saying, and I think that is how I anchored it as well initially, but I'd like us to be a little bit more pragmatic and think about things that we could actually do to improve by looking at other models to start off with, maybe, right?
Yeah.
You talked about corruption. When we look at Singapore, they have much higher standards in terms of ministerial conduct. Let's talk a little bit about that, how you feel about what we could learn from the Singapore model.
And also, are people being held to account, and people in the public eye and politicians and so forth, much, much more rigorously today than they ever were before? But I'm just curious
about... Are they being held
about...
to account? No, I don't believe they are.
By us and by the media,
no,
I mean.
Definitely not. Standards have fallen substantially. But I would argue that our media, large parts of our media, certainly in the UK, but I think to some extent in America, have given up the role of holding to account anybody who shares their basic worldview. So at the moment, take the situation regarding Labour's Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner. over a story, did she or didn't she fill in this form, fill in that form?
Yeah.
Sums of money that to most of these Tories are literally peanuts over the sale of a council house before she was even an MP, which gets more debate and more coverage than multi-million-pound frauds, than Sunak putting people into the House of Lords who've given 15 million quid. You mentioned Singapore.
Yeah.
As I was on the train coming here, I got an email from a minister in Singapore who thought I would be interested in a post that he just put on his Facebook page, which was about an article that The Economist has run about Singapore.
Okay.
And it's not that long, but let me just see if I think it's brilliant. The Economist cannot resist sneering at us. It's an instinct lodged deep in the unconscious of the British commentariat class. They can't stand that the people they were accustomed to lecturing are now doing better than they are across the board. Take governments. DPM Lawrence, that's their current Deputy Prime Minister, who's about to become the Prime Minister, will be our fourth Prime Minister in 59 years. In the UK, Mr Rishi Sunak is their fourth Prime Minister in 4.9 years. Mr Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, accepted a holiday worth £15,000 and £50,000 for renovation of his residence from donors. In Singapore, anyone who did what Mr Johnson did would have been charged in court. On the economy, we started as a British colony with per capita GDP of $500. Now it's more than 80,000. According to a recent Forbes report, we have the fifth highest GDP per capita in the world by purchasing power parity terms, well ahead of the UK. On our media, The Economist refers to our docile press. It obviously prefers a situation like in the UK, where one person can control major media outlets, have politicians pay court to him, and where media owners can influence who gets elected and who becomes PM. A similar situation in Australia was described by a former Australian Prime Minister as a cancer on democracy. We provide our people of all classes and races with better healthcare, housing and education. Law and order situation in London is well documented. It then goes through the stats. Situation like this, he talks about in 100 neighbourhoods, 0% of reported car thefts were solved. A situation like that would be unthinkable in Singapore.
But you are talking about rights versus security, though, aren't you?
Let me give you the final one. Or in social cohesion, in the UK, a Tory party donor recently said of a black MP that looking at her makes him want to hate all black women. His party said all should just move on from the comments and that's it. In Singapore, anyone who made such a comment would be charged in court. What price your sneer? So there you are. That's
it's a very good letter.
It's a great letter. I would say so too. Thanks for reading it out. So what do you think we can take away from the model there and adopt here? Obviously, you have allegiances in this upcoming general election, I assume, right?
I do.
And there's a new government maybe coming in, right?
I hope so.
So what can they run on that would borrow from the Singaporean model? I
don't know what to borrow from the Singaporean model. I think there are things in policy, I think. It's very interesting, for example, to give you another example from Singapore. In education, they have been absolutely at the forefront of, it's about results, and they're always very high up in the kind of global league tables and so forth. They're now changing. Mm-hmm. They're now moving to a much more... seeing education as
less
about
hothouse.
Developing people as citizens.
Creativity.
And I'd like us to do more of that. Look, I think generally on politics, the first thing is to accept that our politics is in a very unhealthy state, and then to try to work out the reasons why that has happened. And some of them we've already talked about, and the others no doubt we'll come on to. So I think we've got a massive problem related to political education.
Right.
Exacerbated by the sort of politics I talked about earlier, this very old-fashioned model of what politics is and what a politician is, exacerbated by a media that, as I say, no longer sees itself as a service of public information and education, but actually an expression of a different form of political power, particularly the print media. Social media now making it like a cesspit a lot of the time. And then if you get somebody like Musk and the sort of games he plays with Twitter, then it makes it worse. So I think on political education, that's where I start on this. And I think it's a generational thing. I don't think we're going to fix this very, very quickly. It's a generational thing. We've got to revive a sense of people's general understanding of the importance of politics. So on that, I would have political education in schools from primary schools. In fact, my next book is a children's book explaining what politics is, one for primary schools, one for senior schools. I would lower the voting age. I would lower the voting age and probably have, this is something I talked to Sadiq Khan about recently, you know, that a lot of the polling stations are in schools, have them in schools and kids can vote. And you don't get the day off school, you get the day off to talk about the election and the issues and then
great,
you vote.
yeah.
I would favour compulsory voting. I think those countries,
that was the other thing.
You know, I was in Australia a few weeks ago, and it's really interesting when you talk to Australian politicians, including the ones who were against it when the change was made. They say it's had several effects. One is that it's much harder for extremists to gain traction in a system where they know that it's not just going to be 2/3 of people who vote, but everybody's going to vote.
Right.
Because the kind of the centre of gravity develops in a different place. The second thing they said is that it does improve the level of public debate.
And of engagement, presumably.
Yeah, people just feel, even if they grumble about it, oh, God, I've got to vote. You know, at least they'll think about it a bit more than they do. So that, and then the other thing they say is that they feel that once a government is elected, even on a system where they haven't necessarily got a majority of the vote, at least it's come through a process in which everybody has been involved.
Yeah.
So I would definitely go for compulsory voting. Yeah. And I think then the other thing is, I think we have to revisit how we have got to this place where the book, I talk about 3 Ps: populism, polarization, and post-truth.
Right.
How have those 3 things been allowed to take such a hold in our politics and our culture? And how do we reverse those?
Just to go back to mandatory voting, how would you then penalise people who didn't?
Small fine.
What happens if a lot of the people that didn't vote are people who are perhaps overwhelmed, who don't have a permanent address, who aren't able to administer? Yeah, you're hitting the same.
You might, but I think that, put it this way, the numbers who don't vote in the countries that have compulsory voting are tiny.
Right.
And there will always be people like that, and you'll always find, and actually, as long as there's a kind of understanding that there will be people who are ill, there will be people who are dying and all that. Yeah. But I think in general, as long as you surround it with a kind of proper public information campaigning. I noticed walking through the cemetery on the lamppost at the bottom, there's an advert for voter ID. The fact that you need voter ID for elections in the UK. As long as people are informed. Postal voting is pretty much universal now in most democracies of the world. You do a postal vote. So I don't think that's an insurmountable problem.
This reminds me of something you guys were discussing on Trip, The Rest is Politics. You were talking about Switzerland and the fact that the referenda there, that the federal state infrastructure is relatively devolved to the local government. Yeah. But that is paired, and I think this goes back to what you're saying right now, with a very docile media that is very informative and takes it upon themselves to make sure that people are armed with knowledge to participate in that referendum and referenda.
And that's a cultural issue.
Yes.
Now
so how do we address that?
Well, I don't know. Yeah. That is. I mean,
you're doing your part.
I kind of am trying to, but it's a small part because I'm one person and there are lots of people. Exactly. But so I think that, look, I'm desperate for Labour to win the election here, but I am actually quite disappointed that they've dropped any interest in the whole Leveson inquiry, the process about our press. I understand politically why they just think, let sleeping dogs lie, leave it. But I don't think you'll necessarily change this political culture until that culture has changed. Now, it is changing of itself because of the technological changes forcing them to revisit different models. The sales are declining, but it's not being replaced by anything better. That's the problem. Lots of talking to Sadiq Khan last night, and he was saying, something like TikTok comes along, everybody thinks, oh, whiz bang, exciting, connected with the youth and all this stuff, but it's become a real problem. That is now such a major source of people's information, which could be true, might not be true, but we're all being algorithmized out of hell. At the moment, I cannot go on social media without seeing Liz Truss or Nigel Farage. Well, don't tell me that's because I want to, because I don't.
What have you been searching for?
It's like that guy. Do you remember that guy, the Tory MP who stood up in the House of Commons and said, we've got to do something about this internet thing was every time I turn on my phone, I'm being bombarded with pornographic images.
Yeah, what is this? His search history is the question there.
There's also, again, I think it's called the news movement on TikTok. Who are trying to change.
Oh, yeah, or Book Talk is great.
Yeah,
Book Talk is
so
great.
we just...
Oh, yeah, listen, there's
with
loads
all
of
of
good
this,
stuff.
there's good innovation as well.
Correct. No, and I think that, I mentioned Musk. I think Musk has been a bit of a disaster for social media. But at the same time, it seems to have spawned all sorts of responses to the changes that he's made, so that and when you see something and it's just when you see that thing below it that says, fact check, you kind of know it's only there because it's wrong, so you kind of move on. And so, we're all adapting and we're all evolving, but I think we'd be hard-pressed to say that we have a healthier media debate than we did. I think it's got worse. And the other thing I'd say is we have more media space than ever, but I'm not sure we have more debate than ever, and I'm not sure we have more understanding than ever. And where we do have greater understanding, I think it's often sort of pocketed. Now, I think that there's loads of lessons, there's loads of sort of messages of hope around the place. I mean, you mentioned our podcast. I've been sort of genuinely taken aback by how many young people listen to it.
Yeah.
Two blokes, I'm 67, Rory's in early 50s, both out of politics, front line as it were.
Yeah.
And yet, when we did the Albert Hall, first of all, 6,000 people paying to come in here and talk about politics.
Yeah.
Over 30% of the audience was under 30.
Wow.
Which says to me there is a hunger and a desire for something more than TikTok, something more than the papers give them.
When you said your book was a response to so much of the correspondence and letters that you'd had, that's why you wrote it.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's so heartening. That's really, really exciting.
No, the title, But What Can I Do, came from people saying that.
Yeah.
What can I do? I'm desperate.
I think it was a great title, actually, and we had to look at it as well.
Citizen Bellingcat.
There's some great stuff. There's some great stuff. I think some of the new kids on the media block have been good. I work for the New European. I think it does some great journalism. Byline Times does some great journalism.
But so with all of this movement, to go back to the idea of changing
the models,
structures, models, like how do we start that? How do we, because I know your argument by and large, at least what I've heard of it, is that you engage in the system that we're in and you get involved in politics. And so many of these movements are outside of that, whether it's the Extinction Rebellion movement, whether it's Bellingcat Group, whether it's they're not using legacy models, are they? They're trying to break and hack them and come up with new ways of doing things, which I'm very interested in.
They are part of politics because they're trying to change politics in the way that they do politics.
But
I don't think they're maybe.
But they're campaigning outside.
They're campaigning, but they're campaigning in order to have influence and in order to make change.
Right.
And I would argue that they are making change.
But they don't want to get inveigled in the system. What I mean is they've lost faith in the system, haven't they? Which is why...
They might have lost faith in the system, but they also know that to get what they want, they're going to have to influence the system. And they do influence the system. I think one of the difficulties with being in campaigning organisations is that you never quite know where and when the change is coming. I write a lot about Greta Thunberg in the book, and I think she has moved the dial on the debate. No doubt about it. As an individual, as one person, she's moved the dial.
Yeah.
Now, has she achieved everything she set out to? No. Has she ended climate change as a threat? No. Has she persuaded every politician in the world they should do more? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. But has she, as a campaigner, shown that campaigning can change politics? I've got no doubt about that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Let me give you maybe my perspective as somebody who's in tech. And maybe actually let me anchor this to Dominic Cummings. He's been doing the rounds on podcasts, and he's been basically saying Number 10 and the PM are obsessed with headlines, and they're the flag in the wind, depending on what the press is saying on the day. The civil service is purporting its own bureaucracy and therefore resisting any change, because that's how the infrastructure will remain, the people in power will remain in power. So therefore,
I agree with the first part of that. I don't entirely agree with
and I don't even know any of whether any of that is true, and I'd love to hear your opinion. But he's been going on these tech podcasts, and a lot of people in tech are excited about hearing this. Now, I'll tell you why that is, because my perspective is I can start a company tomorrow and change and impact this world in ways that are orders of magnitude faster, more direct, more exciting, seemingly, than if I'd want to go into politics.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is the competitive landscape of the political system and engaging with it needs to look sexier and has competition now, right? Compared to other ways you can now very quickly have impact on this world through social media followers, right? And like creating an alternative channel like Greta Thunberg did, or to become an entrepreneur and build that.
Yeah.
So the system of engaging with politics by saying, hey, we have models you can engage with, just go and do that, feels a little bit out of touch with the competition of other ways people can have an impact in this world.
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that. But you see, but I think we've got to be careful about this, because I think one of the things that's going on in our politics, which is really weakening us as a democracy, is the fact that the politicians have become too kind of, I guess a symbol of it was when Sunak had that artificial intelligence summit.
Yeah, Bletchley Park.
And he sat down with Elon Musk, and, he's the prime minister of one of the most important countries in the world, and he looks like a fanboy of this guy who's kind of just a bit of a sort of cavalier buccaneer. And I think that's bad for politics, because I think that I'm obsessed with this book, The Sovereign Individual.
Oh, yeah.
Which
this is Rees-Mogg's dad.
Yeah, Rees-Mogg's dad, who basically had this vision of taking the wealthy and the powerful out of any democratic control. I think that's what Sunak's father-in-law is all about. I think what it is about, what these free ports are about, and these special economic zones and so forth. It's about taking people out of any kind of democratic oversight. So I worry about that. However, I think Cummings has got a point, I think his loathing of the civil service is way off kilter.
Right.
The civil service, in my experience, is a pretty good, not brilliant, but pretty good, provided it's given clear and honest and straightforward direction.
Right.
If you have somebody like Johnson in charge of it and Cummings alongside him, don't be surprised if it's all going to go tits up. But I think actually so where he was right is in saying that you had somebody like Johnson, and to a lesser extent somebody like Sunak now. You're seeing this. We're talking on a day that Sunak's making a sort of yet another back of the fag packet speech about the future of, I don't know, the health service. I mean, just like day after day, thinking of something new to say just for the sake of, as you say, getting a headline. That's just defunct. It's finished as a kind of political model, and yet they're still addicted to it. So I would say that he's got a point about the politicians, less of a point about the civil service. And I think that if you're a young person thinking, right, how am I going to make a difference in the world? Absolutely right. You can do it through business. You can do it through culture. There's lots of different ways you can do it. But ultimately, every single thing that you do is going to have at some stage contact with the political process somewhere in the world.
Exactly.
So therefore, we still have to have good people who are going to become our politicians.
Yes.
And my worry is that politics has become so unfashionable, so derided, so low, that we're ever narrowing the gene pool of the people who even think about doing it.
Should I throw the job thing in there? Yeah, I'll throw the job thing.
I mean, the job thing, and also what I really want to get to is a mindset change, and I guess a story change around when did we get to the place, or was it ever thus? I don't think it was. Taxation, let's just say, for example, you're talking about, the sort of 1% who seem to be exempt. I pay tax because it helps me. It's an insurance of all kinds of things. If my neighbour is, more equal to me, or if I'm more equal to my neighbour, there's going to be less conflict. I don't understand how we've got to the place where tax is considered a punishment. That's where we are right now. And no one sees it as a benefit. How do we change that? How do we tip that back to a place of citizenship and caring for how other people are managing?
Well, you say everyone thinks like that. I mean, you and I think alike on that. We've only just met. But I'm imagining you think like that.
I don't mind paying more tax.
There doesn't seem to be a correlation between... There's a disconnect. Everyone wants a better health service. Everyone wants better education for their kids. When it comes to paying a large part of your salary towards that, if you're lucky enough to earn more than enough, there's a problem.
Yeah, but I think that the answer to the question, how do we get to this, is that I mean, politics goes through waves, and there are certain periods of political history that really, really matter, and you get big change that lasts. And one of those periods of big change that lasts in our lifetime was the whole kind of Thatcher-Reagan period, where the sense of, to put it derogatively, selfishness, no such thing as society, which she never actually said, but that's became the sort of label for her philosophy, where it takes on a grip and it takes a hold, and then alongside it, you do have this sense of a sort of a more buccaneering approach to the economy and entrepreneurs and so forth. And it takes a long time for something like that to shift. I would argue in government, funny, if I did this event with Will Hutton that I mentioned, and Will Hutton has just written a book where he's saying that he actually thinks Thatcher has been the cause of most of our problems. And he was sort of praiseworthy of what we did as the government, the Labour government, in some aspects, but said actually he felt our big failure was not to challenge those basic orthodoxies. We kind of accepted
you I would say imbibed them and sort of reframed them.
I think we remodeled some, and we challenged some, and we rejected some, but that sort of taking as a base for both political and economic reasons, and you can put them in whichever you want because you've got to win to make change. So I think we did make a lot of change that I can defend as somebody who can say I'm sort of, very much on the left of politics, but I accept we did it accepting quite a lot of a base that we spent a lot of our time when she was doing it absolutely raging against. So I think that's the honest answer. I think that we are, I don't know whether we've always been selfish, but I think we've become more selfish as people. I think the nation state, which on the one hand is a kind
and yet lockdown happens and all you see is a proliferation of kindness and neighbourliness and volunteering and doing things for free for absolutely nothing in return. So, and that's what I have faith in as a model.
That's good. And I think that's right. That's right.
But how do we, what I want to know is how, which Natasha, I feel is an innate...
In democracies, we have to elect governments that are more likely to be imbibing those values than the values that we've just been talking about. And it's such a complicated narrative around that.
If we're in a system which you've just cited where people, and even in your podcast when you were talking about, when Rory was talking about running for mayor, that he became obsessed with what the polls were saying or what the media was reporting back. So he started playing to that rather than his truth or his integrity. And what happened? He didn't win. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's what I mean about the old model. How did somebody like Macron come along and do what he did? Now, he's not as popular as he was.
France is, I think it's so different to here.
Well, it may be different. Every country's different.
He alienated both sides. Different. That's what he does.
En même temps.
Yeah, en même temps.
But in terms of how he got there, or give an example that's maybe quite uncomfortable. How has Nigel Farage become such an influential figure?
It's probably more interesting.
Is by essentially by having, whether they're real or manufactured, I think it's a bit of both, but having a worldview and specific views that he just never, ever, ever, ever tires of putting over, and eventually builds support because he speaks to something.
Because he looks strong.
Because he communicates clarity, because he's very effective at not being challenged. He uses the media incredibly well. So my point is, when you say how do we get these changes, get people to move to a different kind of mindset, we, whoever we are, have to do it by having that mindset ourselves. So I can go in, some days I can wake up, and like next week, I'm going into a couple of schools. And if I wake up in a good mood, I'm thinking, great, I'm going to do that. If I wake up in a bad mood, I think, fuck, why am I doing this again? What is the point? This is getting nowhere. This is never going to change. Once you've got that mindset, you're out of the game.
Yeah, of course.
So you've got to, anybody who believes in anything has to just fight for those beliefs all the time and never stop.
Yeah, I think this individual responsibility makes sense. Firstly, I would say, the problem I would have, if I wanted to go into politics right now, is that I have two parties and they both have set menus. And I have to somehow subscribe to most of the set menu to be successful.
Yeah.
It's very hard to have your own way. And you see, I think Farage, for all his faults and, whatever we think about him, he seems fairly authentic. For some reason, he's at least seems authentic, and he's completely doing his own thing, quote unquote, right? I think that when you are trying to come into a two-party system, you have to assimilate a little bit. And that, in a very individualistic society that we've created now, is unbecoming to many people.
Yeah, but listen, I accept a lot of that. But
Yeah.
just go through the history of the Labour Party in the time that I've been involved in it.
Right.
So let's start with Michael Foot in 1983. Okay. So there's Michael Foot, very serious guy, very intelligent guy, but up against Thatcher, very, very difficult, loses. Neil Kinnock takes over.
Mm-hmm.
Neil Kinnock, probably more left-wing than John Smith and more left-wing than Tony Blair.
And if I may interrupt you, when people say now is the
More
most
polarized
time ever, then I would point to that time to say, no, that's not true.
You say that all the time. And yet I look back to my young childhood. The parties were so polarized. They were so completely different.
Yeah, I think when I talk about, I think there's a difference between having parties that are wide apart and a political culture that thrives on polarization.
I see,
Slightly different things. I put the polarization stuff more into the culture war space,
right?
Which I don't think we had in the same way then. But the point I'm making is that Michael Foot, Neil Kinnock, John Smith, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn, now Keir Starmer.
Yes.
That's not been the same Labour Party.
No, you're right.
At various stages. It changes all the time. So
true.
You're right that an individual is never, even if you're the leader, you're never going to have the whole menu that you want. But you will change according who's winning and losing the argument.
And that may be a very good thing, by the way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That there are checks and balances.
But the level of variance obviously is not much. And that's okay, because, when we say we can't just throw all historical knowledge and learning that we have away out of the window.
No, and also, one of the reasons I think the Conservatives are in such a mess is because actually Johnson in particular, and then Truss, and now Sunak to a lesser extent, they're sort of operating like they're Farage. Mm-hmm. Farage can say what the hell he wants, and he does say what the hell he wants, because he's not actually in a position of authority.
Exactly.
He's a one-man band leading his own party, essentially, even though he's not technically the leader. And that's a totally different... Farage would be dreadful in government.
Oh, of course.
And he knows that.
Yeah.
Right. But, so what you have instead... So the point you made about Rory Stewart is very, very interesting, because I said to him on that podcast, I said, I think you were right and they were wrong. Mm-hmm. You're obsessed about planting trees, and that's a good thing to say. As if it's the only thing, if it's the only thing you say, then you've got a problem. But don't be driven by some pollster telling you, "Oh, we tested that; it didn't work." Yeah. That's Sunak's problem at the moment. I can spot it every time he goes out. He's delivering rehearsed lines in these awful sort of stand-up pooled clips. And they've been tested to death. And when you talk about authenticity, people know that's.
But it's become more and more generic. The whole message. But go back to your structural.
Let me actually tie it up to a point that you made earlier. You asked me, am I happy with paying taxes? I am very happy with paying taxes. I am happy with paying more taxes even. But when I see corruption, when I see PPE scandals, when I see all this stuff, then I have a problem with paying more taxes.
And I can see why.
Let's take this a step further. I saw a job posting recently for the Deputy Director AI International. Mm-hmm. This person's supposed to be the key liaison.
A government job.
Yeah, government.
UK.
Yeah, UK, exactly. The key liaison for the UK to the world, talking about AI safety and providing thought leadership. Now, to G7, G20. Now, this job...
I know what you're going to tell me.
This job... pays 75K.
Okay, I was going to go 63. So there we go.
75K. So what this suggests to me, one is you either independently wealthy taking this job on. Yeah. Two, it means that you're a complete idealist taking on this job. Mm-hmm. Or three, it means that you're using this job as a means to end up in a private sector job, greasing the wheels of government once you're out of it.
Or four,
you're
a committed public servant who believes in public service.
Yeah, well,
that was
that's
my
the
argument.
idealism, I think. That's probably idealism, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
idealism, yeah, I would say. Or you're not qualified to do this job,
Yeah,
right?
entirely possible.
So my point is, I am willing to pay more taxes, and I'm also willing for us to pay more for these jobs.
To recruit the
right?
best.
Yeah, I agree. Right, okay.
This is technocrats, elitist type of approach to government. But we have the most complex structures that civilization has created are governments. And they're probably coordinating the most important problems that we're supposed to solve as civilization and societies.
And we're not.
And we're not putting the most capable, or we're not at least incentivizing, quote unquote, the most capable people to take these jobs and hold them really accountable.
I know we need to say specific, but just in case we lose the thread of this and competence, I want to go to NHS. I remember Martin, my late husband, who was a surgeon and worked in the NHS. One of his biggest criticisms was this sort of constant clarion call for more money. Mm-hmm. And his view was that was a sort of smoke and mirror screen to not actually organising it and not getting better administrators, that all of the people who would be most competent running and I know it's changed hugely in the last 16 years, and now we're in computerized systems, and back then was still, what he couldn't understand is it was still a fountain pen and a bit of paper.
So more money for competence rather than for money for money.
And actually then to your point about going to McKinsey or whoever it is and trying to ask for solutions and paying huge fees to the private sector.
McKinsey,
why
Boston
not
Consulting
get those
Group and all that?
people
Like,
and
why shouldn't
recruit
they work in
them
government instead?
into the service in the first place? And you would be saving billions.
I know. I mean, this is I think this goes back to the point we were making earlier about people's general motivations, and I think it's also a consequence of having pretty constant denigration of the values of public service.
Right.
So we see that in politics itself with the politicians. We also see it with the civil service. They get kicked about by everybody.
You mean the media does?
I also mean the politicians. I think that one of the worst things that this government has done is the constant denigration, blaming. Yeah. This thing about, Whitehall blob. It was Cummings, Gove who invented that, the blob.
It's the swamp.
Drain the swamp. It's like anybody who's there is only there. Yeah. Essentially, that's Trump. When he talks about drain the swamp, he's putting his own motivations in public life upon every single person who works in the public service. Yeah. I know loads of people who work in public service who probably could get. I think of Jeremy Haywood, who was cabinet secretary under us, and he was Tony's advisor. He worked for John Major, he worked for several prime ministers. He went off for a couple of years in the middle, made a load of money in the bank, hated it, made a lot of money. Yeah. What did he do? He came back. Right. Because he had a genuine...
But he then was independently wealthy at that point.
That is a point. And I worry that politics is going to go down that route.
This is the problem.
Exactly.
I totally agree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That, you can only... Because because of the way politics is portrayed and derided, imagine if... Let's get back to Singapore. Singapore has the best paid politicians in the world. They go out and recruit people and say, we'd like you to come and be a politician and get in the cabinet. They pay them over $1 million.
Yes, exactly.
They're not even the best paid people in government.
Yeah. I know.
There are civil servants who get more because they go out and hire them from other places. Now, so that in a sense is bringing the market.
But tell me what you think about that.
I don't know what I think, but I think that it works for them. I think here in our current politics, it would be impossible because you'd have to get Parliament to vote to give ministers a massive pay rise, and people would just be on the streets. So you have to.
You can't just do that without.
You can only do that with a new system.
Yeah, well, that's a good conversation. But what I would also say, Alistair, is you can only do that if you give something back at the same time. And that is, we are going to get these people, but then these are things that we are now going to adhere to. These are targets that we're publicly putting on the website that we're going to measure against, and these people are going to have to live up to these expectations that are very specific.
And they will be devotional and not take second jobs or have...
These things aren't straightforward. I just think what I'd really like Labour to do, I don't think they're going to do it, but what I'd really like them to do is to get in, say that they've had to get elected under the system that we have, but there is a growing sense in the country that the current system doesn't work. We're going to have a fundamental review of the entirety of our political system.
I'd love that.
I'd love that. Now, I'll give you an example, though, of where the politics of that become...
But then you're not being transparent, are you? We go back to...
No, you are being transparent. I'd like them to say...
You mean that's part of their manifesto?
Yeah, they say we're going to have a fundamental review of our political system.
Yeah.
Now, let me give you an example of where that would be incredibly difficult in practical terms.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's say they put in the manifesto, we're going to have a Royal Commission on the future of our political system with a view to changing A, B, C, D, E. Okay, so it's in the manifesto.
Right.
And examples are like abolition of the House of Lords or something.
Yeah, or absolutely fundamental reform of the second chamber, greater devolution to towns and cities and regions, compulsory voting, political education, lowering the voting age, sort of stuff we're talking about. Funding of parties, powers of the Electoral Commission. I've just come back from Australia. Yeah, I've just come back from Australia, where the Premier of South Australia is bringing forward legislation to ban all political donations.
Lovely.
Oh, God, that's brilliant.
That's great. Yeah.
And there's a debate going on in Australia on that now. So, but then what does that mean? It means you're going to say to the public, oh, by the way, we have to have campaigns, you have to have public information. Do you mind paying for it?
You have to donate. Yeah.
And they might.
I feel
and they might.
We would be keen on that.
Let's say Labour win an election on that basis, okay? They then have to get every piece of legislation through the system that we have.
Yeah.
Right, including the House of Lords. So how can they do that in the House of Lords? Answer by sticking in another load.
Yeah, of Labour peers.
Yeah. At which point people say, hold on a minute, you're the guys who talk about changing it.
Yeah,
it's so hard to do.
Yeah.
But I think you can only do that kind of thing if you signal it, you flag it, you say you're going to do it, and you then get a big mandate.
Yeah.
That's why.
And by the way, if it fails at the House of Lords at that point, then you bring the media in and then you make us think about it.
Or do you dare do another referendum?
Or you dare do another referendum.
We've had enough of those. But so this is where you talk about idealism.
Yes.
You know, the idealist is somebody who believes and can see clearly the progress that can be made through big change. At some point, it has to confront a political reality. Mm-hmm. The reason why, and here's an interesting fact for you. Well, fact is polling. In every continent in the world, the decile of the population that is most attracted to authoritarianism is
the lower educated,
the young.
The young. Oh, wow.
Young.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So on the one hand, we like to think, kids are idealistic. They're quite attracted to authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. They look at Putin getting away with what he gets away with. They look at Xi Jinping in China. They look at Modi.
But is it because they see maverick?
They see maverick, they see strong, they see leader, they see get stuff
But smashing
done.
The system on some level,
and they're disruptors.
Yeah.
So, and our system, of which we're so proud, mother of all parliaments and all that, the process goes back to your earlier point. The processes are so slow.
Yes.
In a world where everything moves so quickly.
Unappealing.
That makes politics harder.
Yeah.
Now, so you probably do at some point have to smash up the system, but you can't just smash up the system.
Or you get some entrepreneurial. You pay people better, and you get
then,
some entrepreneurial minds that come in and reconceive.
But your point, that tends to be people of independent wealth who are looking to put something back at the end of a career. And I've seen so many people who...
No, but it won't be if people are paid properly. Then you can have someone...
To pay them properly, I'm saying you have to go through a lot of political pain because of the negativity that surrounds politics and government. So, and also, just to say to you that I've seen very, very clever people who've come in from a business background, from an entrepreneurial background, taken up positions...
And are frustrated.
They just can't do it. They can't do politics. The one that I always think was a standout, we brought in David Sainsbury as a science minister, and you talk to anybody in the science sector, he was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. But there are other people. I remember when David Simon came in from BP, and he was in the Treasury, and you think, well, there's a guy, he's run big companies, he knows the world inside out. He suddenly found that every single decision he'd been made, every piece of money that he'd ever been made was being put through the kind of, the Sunday Times Insight ringer.
Right.
And he was like,
it's not worth it.
What's this about?
Yeah.
I'm trying to help.
Yeah.
But also getting early education in politics and in investment, unless you study politics A-level,
you don't get it.
You don't get it.
It's hopeless.
Which is a tiny, tiny minority of people.
So where are people getting they're getting their
through the media.
From the media, from their parents, from TikTok, from whatever it might be, or they're just opting out of the system completely. Because I knew what we were going to talk about. When I was on the train this morning, I was doing a little sort of human being observation, as I often do on the train. So I was in a carriage. There were 11 people in the carriage on the overground. 9 were on their phones. Okay, 1 was reading a book. But of the 9 who were on the phone, at one point, I got up to have a wander and have a look. Well, I'd say
Angry Bird.
5 on Instagram.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying too.
Just doing the thumb.
Same as well.
The rest, I'd say, were on what I would call practical. They were
on a calendar or
train times,
Gmail. Can I throw just a sentence in that was an epiphany I had the other day? And that is...
Epiphany?
Yes, epiphany,
Ooh.
I would say. Loss of trust in institutions is directly proportional to increase in bandwidth. What do you think about that?
Loss of trust in institutions?
Yes. So what I'm trying to say, obviously, this is like a roundabout way of saying it, is that the problem is obviously that a lot of the media landscape has shifted.
So it's going to change to something better. It could change to something better.
Yes,
Yeah.
It could. However, what has happened so far is that
It's worse.
It's gotten worse.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right?
So it could have got better.
Yes.
And it still might.
And it still might. And there was
Yes.
a time when I thought it was.
Yes.
I remember when social media first came along.
Yes.
I was a bit of a sort of slow to catch up to. I had this guy who worked for me called Mark Bennett, who's sadly dead now. But I remember him saying to me, he said, this Twitter thing's made for you. You'd love it. You'd love it. And I was like, oh, fuck off. Can't bother with that. And so then I got into it. And I thought,
You became addicted.
Not addicted, but a bit. But I can see the benefits in so many ways. But I think as a whole, in terms of its impact, particularly on young people,
Mental health.
engaged and mental health, also their engagement, understanding of issues,
Concentration.
I think it's become terrible.
Yeah.
So it could have been good. It could have been good. And it still might be good. What follows might be good. But I do think that whole world has become something of a sewer. And I'm not sure how we unpick and undo it. Something better has to replace it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's down to you guys.
Well, the hope was always in my mind that technology would be a force to increase empathy. The technology should not be built for maximizing engagement. The actual measure that we should be tracking is increase empathy between people. And you realize that if you just have
and
text
sometimes
here,
that happens.
It happens, exactly.
Yeah.
And you know when it actually happens the most? When you hear somebody else's voice. And that's why I like the podcast model so much. Because I feel like we're one-way friends. Because I'm hearing your voice and I'm feeling empathy cues that kick in because I'm hearing you and your intonation and your emotional valence of the things that you're saying, etc. But if I just read the same on text, I lose so much fidelity. And that could be misinterpreted by my brain so thoroughly. Right. And that's why I think all these models that are very text based end up very quickly to lowest common denominator kind of reactions by people's brains. Oh, you hate me. Oh, you said this, you said that, because there's a level of fidelity that's missing, which you get through voice, which you get through video, which you get through these type of medium.
You've never been on social media, have you?
No, I do
You have a Twitter.
I have a Twitter,
you
but
don't really engage
it's
in it.
really to do with filtering news sources.
I'm getting close to giving it up. I probably won't because I the arrogant in me thinks my voice matters. But actually, it's also when you're doing things like flogging tickets with the O2 or flogging books and stuff.
No,
or
that's great.
events, it still is a really, really good thing to have on your side. But I find now that when I go on and just am doing the thing that the people on the train were doing, just sort of using my thumb to kind of see the world, I just think this is not a world I want to be in.
Yeah.
It's horrible. So something better can come.
Yes.
And if you think about the time span historically in which all of these things have come.
Oh, it's
And
part
how
of the
quick-
continuum. It's just
Yeah.
minuscule,
Yeah.
which is why I'm saying let's be patient. I feel like we've lost so much patience around building new models of things.
Yeah, because we live in
A fast world.
that world. Everything can be there for us at our fingertips whenever we want it, or so we
Infinite
think.
knowledge, yeah.
But we
we
shouldn't revert back to something that's old and that we've outgrown and is a skin that we should lose for fear of the next thing not coming. It's not going to come unless we try new ways of doing things and some kind of devolution and experimenting in smaller areas rather than the entire country and just the admin involved in trying to implement something new on that scale. Do it on a smaller scale and let it fail or not fail and then learn from that. Like the two things, one in education, where we have this good development, which is a lot more inclusive of kids who learn differently and neurodiversity and a lot more support for that. And the messaging being, it's good to try new ways of doing things and it's okay to fail because that's how you learn. And yet what we see in the public arena or through the media or through our leaders is you cannot fail. And if you do, you sort of have to lie about it. That there can be no failure, that we can't learn or that we can't collaborate. In the two-party system, if one party did something that's actually quite good and successful, it can't really be harnessed by the incoming. How do we get those things to work? It just doesn't make sense.
I agree. But you're never going to take out difference in politics because it's through the differences that things emerge.
Absolutely. But that through those differences and disagreements and discussion, a new collaborative way can then...
Well, I do. The other thing I do hope, if there is a new Labour government, that they do start to kind of refashion the way that policy is made as well.
Right.
I do think there have been some amazing examples of good citizens' assemblies. The one in Ireland on abortion was incredible.
We were talking about that yesterday.
There's one going on in France at the moment about assisted dying.
Yeah.
And these are like...
Oh, yeah.
Almost like selected...
Yes, I forgot about that.
They're almost selected like juries.
Yes, exactly.
You know, and then you say, are you prepared to give up 5 weekends or whatever it might be? And they go away and they put them up in a nice hotel and they have presentations of all the facts and different points of view, and then they sit around and talk about it. And, you know, I just think that's more interesting than the way we do. I mean, Rory Stewart was this week in the podcast. He's very funny talking about him, but it's just not funny because she became the Prime Minister, but talking about the way that Liz Truss kind of threw our ideas out and just sort of literally random ideas to try and get in the papers with something new and edgy and interesting. And, you know, before you know it, that's law and it's policy. It's mad. Yeah. So I think there is, but that kind of thing will only happen if the politicians who are already there get a sense that the public want that kind of thing to happen.
Yes.
If all the message the politicians get is, oh, you're all the same, oh, you're all in it for yourself and all that stuff, which they do get a lot of.
Yeah.
Don't be surprised if they just retreat on themselves and their own processes.
But to come out of England for a second, and this is going to be very contentious, I suppose, but talking about, I have a South American friend from El Salvador who says to me that people have responded to his government and, or rather the criticism that America has had around that 90%. Yeah, but his win, what was it? Was it 90%? I can't remember. Yeah, anyway, that there's no way that was viable, and a lot of people got incredibly angry about so-called, you know, advanced democracies commenting on systems that may not suit that country but do suit their country, and we do have this idea that everywhere should be a democracy.
Well,
and how flexible are you on that? And what do you think about, as you said, a lot of young people voting? I mean, look, I think the first thing is there's no such thing as a perfect political system. There's no such thing as a perfect political leader. And I think there is a bit of a, you know, to go back to the letter from our friend in Singapore. Yeah. He's basically saying that the great colonial powers always think that they did it best. And I would say that I think the point, John Major actually made a very, very good speech a while back, and it was called "In Democracy We Trust?" And the question mark was incredibly telling, because he then went on to say, "Look, we've got to watch this. We're taking it for granted. You can't take this stuff for granted." I think that somebody like, well, let's take Modi. The election's happening there now. Yeah. He's clearly going to win it. Yeah. Now, we can sit here and say, well, the guy's polarizing, does the Hindu versus Muslim thing. Yes. He's, you know, they've made the judges less independent. They've made the media less independent. They've given the big TV stations to all his mates, he's like a Bollywood star as well. He's completely manipulated.
He's incredible. Right. That's all true. That's all true. But he also does seem to be remarkably popular.
Yeah, that's true.
You don't get to be that popular, even within a kind of rigged system, unless you are.
The country's up and up.
You're speaking to something within people. I don't know enough about El Salvador.
But if they don't have the facts...
No, I know that, but I'm simply saying to you, so...
Because you go back to El Salvador.
I'm going back to El Salvador, so...
But that was a human right. So his human rights.
I can see, and they balance it.
Yeah.
They balance. They say, okay,
security.
I get you don't like it, the fact that he's just throwing people in jails, but we feel safer.
Yeah.
So it's a very within any country, within any culture, getting the balance right is always going to be very, very difficult. And we do have to be careful of looking. This whole thing between the global north and the global south at the moment. Right. The global south looks at some of the military interventions that we did, some of which I was very, very closely involved in. And then they say, well, hold a minute, why should we feel the same way as you do about Ukraine? It's inevitable because none of this stuff's happening in a vacuum. So all you can do is over time, this is why values actually have become more important, not less important. The values at the heart of policymaking have to speak to something enduring. And I think that's the worry, is that that's what I think we've lost from our politics.
2 quick remarks. One is on Modi, I think goes back to a point that you were making, and that is the next generation of Indians is going to be richer than the previous one.
Absolutely.
And it's easy to then be very popular as a prime minister, whatever flaws you may have, right? If you're continuing to be the person that is delivering that. So let's put all the media stuff aside and all the other legislative things that he's doing and judiciary things that he's doing that may play into his hand, but I think that's the story. And
also the other part of that story is that, which he plays brilliantly through his own personality, is it's almost like he's saying, look, if I, the T-boy, can become this great global figure,
but isn't that
imagine what we as a country could be.
But that Trump managed to do that, which was extraordinary, given
Modi
he came with so much money.
Modi's on a different level.
Definitely.
Have you seen some of these rallies?
Yeah.
But isn't that the consistent thing around the populist leader, that they all manage to convince people that they are the everyman? Or the every woman.
It's a people's cause.
And yet it's quite the opposite. They end up being self-serving.
Absolutely. People of the elite telling the populace that they are there for them against the elite. It's a classic old con.
But why do we fall for it?
Because we look for
strong leadership.
We look for clarity. We look for people that we think we can identify with.
But you see, I think this is the crux of the issue, is that actually we give away our power to strong leadership rather than getting involved, becoming citizens who participate in policy, who make decisions together, who want to pay taxes. This is to our benefit. And it's a mindset thing that I feel.
But I'd love to kind of pick up on that, because I wanted to go back and Citizens Assemblies. We went over that too quickly, I feel, because it is an important element
rather than
democracy.
Being a subject. Remember that thing around being the subject, and that's whether it's to the capitalist cow or whether it's to an authoritarian leader, and to come to this stage where we go back to something really ancient, which is collaborative.
Yeah, collaborative, participatory, and
non-nuclear family, all of that kind of stuff.
The beauty of the Citizens Assembly model, if you do it right, is that it can create serendipity, a bottom-up serendipity. The discussion around abortion would have not come out in that extent, and there would have been nobody in government in Ireland that would have picked that topic up again if it hadn't come bottom-up through Citizens Assemblies, right?
Totally agree.
So it allows another path that is outside of the two-party system to create serendipity for discussion around topics that actually matter to people who feel dejected by the actual, model.
Yeah.
Right. And so
I think the other thing that happens in those situations is that the arguments emerge through people that the media find a lot harder to attack.
Right. Exactly.
That's such a good point.
That's a good point.
That's such a good point.
They don't exactly. They don't have anything to lose. Also, it feels like the conversation is more radical.
They're not there to get rich.
It's radical candor. It's radical candor. Right. And cognitive safety at the same time. So it allows for a much more honest conversation. So how would you enshrine that here? You can now have your pick. You have your wish list, Alistair.
Okay.
You can change anything you want tomorrow. You already alluded to some things that you were saying earlier. I think it would be a great place to maybe end to tell us a little bit about your wish list and what you'd like to see.
Look, you talk about my wish list.
Yeah.
I think the country is in a real mess going to take more than a change of government to get us out of it. And insofar as we have a new government, if we get it, it's going to take more than a term.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I hope for is I hope they're in for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I hope they have the boldness to be able to be honest about the extent of the mess that we're in politics,
Mm-hmm.
democracy, and bring forward.
But they will just blame the Conservatives for a very long period of time about the mess that we're in.
Well, they might do.
And
They might do.
that's what
Politically,
happens
they
every
probably will
time.
have to do that. They can do that for a bit. It doesn't take it very far. You have to set in train a process of real radical change. And I hope the change does include fundamental review of the way we do politics, bringing in some of the things that I talked about. Yes, definitely citizens' assemblies, being pretty careful about which subjects you might go for.
Right.
But there's some pretty obvious ones to me.
Yeah.
You might decide the future of the health service is one.
Mm-hmm.
You might. Listen, all of that stuff you can. I don't detect a hunger within the Labour Party for it, unfortunately.
Why?
Oh, really?
Because I think they think they're going to have so much of a mess to sort out on the stuff that people really care about: economy, cost of living, health service, schools, etc. I think that. But when I say I don't detect a hunger, I guess the reason I say that is on the podcast we bang on about citizens' assemblies the whole time.
Yes, you do.
And I don't get the feeling from when I'm talking to politicians, they slightly roll their eyes when. So and then we haven't even touched on the planet stuff. That might be another one actually.
Climate.
But then, and how do we hold to account these promises around, hitting the 20, that we've already missed that, the 2030
targets.
Interim.
I know. Well, how do you hold? There's only one way of holding politicians to account.
Elections, unfortunately.
It is, yeah.
And that's just not good
But
enough.
it becomes meaningless, doesn't it?
No, it's not meaningless.
No, those become meaningless. Those targets, if they're then not met.
I don't think they do, because I think that.
So, i.e., the dream or the promise or the target is motivational rather than a destination.
No, but also I think don't. We have been through an utterly abnormal period of politics. We had Brexit. We've had 5 prime ministers in. The Singaporean guy said 5 prime ministers in a matter of no time.
4.9 years.
Yeah, we've had Johnson.
We've had the pandemic.
We've had Johnson, for whom the manifesto did not mean a thing. That's unusual. Thatcher.
Let's be honest, he was dealing with something unprecedented in the middle.
I'm not buying that.
But you have to put that in there,
No,
otherwise you're just not being realistic about how anyone would have dealt with that.
No, I'm simply saying that he didn't give a damn about his own manifesto. He didn't give a damn about delivering on the promises made for Brexit. It's all a game. Then we've had Truss, utter aberration, and now we've got Sunak. I think having, hopefully, Keir Starmer, somebody who's pretty serious, pretty hardworking, pretty diligent, does actually believe in public service, I think that would be a big change. God agrees. God agrees, or doesn't agree. What was God saying
That's
there?
the climate saying,
That
please.
thunderclap. What was he saying? It's not even raining.
Please, let's stick to the
timing
targets.
was immaculate.
Yeah. Now listen, I've got to run.
Okay, thank you so much.
It's great to have you,
And
Alistair.
nice
Thanks so
to
much
see
for
you. I
taking
hope
the
some of it
time.
made sense.
Yes, thank you.